Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Dev Diary. Today we bring back the original concept for the first version of our Plants vs. Zombies Cross Vampire Survivors mashup, only this time under its own unique identity. But before we go any further, remember to leave a like if you enjoy the video and subscribe if you're new to the channel. Turn on notifications so you don't miss future videos on this and many other projects. And with that said, let's see where we can take the old concept. So just to make sure that we're all on the same page, here's a brief recap of how we got here. The initial idea was an attempt to mash together Plants vs. Zombies and Vampire Survivors, and it ended up being way more elaborate than expected. This concept saw the player utilize a computer to purchase and sell materials for upgrades while also organizing against a continuous onslaught of enemy hordes. Now, it's not like this was a terrible idea for a game, it's just that the idea started to drift from a mashup into new territory that wasn't indicative of either game, which is why it was eventually scrapped, and thus brings us to today's project. Now, the basics remain the same, with the player being able to interact with the world in a top-down manner, but without the restrictions of the mashup aspect means a whole lot more creative freedoms, including this weird screen effect. Wonder what that's all about. Well, let's take a look at the code. Now, we may be reusing an old concept, but this was all coded from scratch. We've got several tile layers and a bunch of variables to get us started. This is also still very much a tower defense concept, so our projectiles are pulled. We've got a turret placement function that'll spawn a turret at the given coordinates and snap it to the grid. And said turrets can then create projectiles with the turret shoot function. And this function will likely grow more elaborate with time as we add more turret types. And moving on, we've got our sync function. This function goes through our objects, tile sets, and the like and makes sure that everything is, well, in sync. So walls are walls, areas are blocked off for building, and so on. And on initiation of our game, the house area is built, the player's computer is spawned, along with the player, a door is set, and projectiles pulled. Now, onto the heart that makes all of this work, the ticker. Starting with the player, we keep track of whether they are within the bounds of the house. This is for multiple reasons. For now, while in the house, the player can access their computer. They will also regain energy while in the house. When outside the house, all interior elements are hidden/deactivated and the player loses energy. And keep those energy nodes in mind for later. And when not using the computer, the player can then place things. For now, it's just turrets. And so while in the build mode, a distance check is made so players can't, place something halfway across the map. Movement is our typical top-down with a check for collision tiles, and placement mode can be toggled via tab key. The spacebar also allows the player to access their computer if near enough, and this interaction will be updated later as we add more furniture options. The rest of the player's code pertains to the weird oscillating wobble during movement and the Paper Mario style flipping behavior. Really, this was just extra testing of new ways to approach potential presentation styles. Moving on to the turret, for the time being, it's quite basic. They will fire a projectile based on a simple cooldown of 30 frames, and much like the player, have a bit of added experimental tweaks to their visuals. They also currently target the mouse's position because enemies have yet to be implemented. And finally, we have the projectiles, which, much like the turrets, are very basic. They move in the direction they are given until off screen, to which they are then sent back to the pool to be reused over and over again. Overall, a lot of this is very familiar ground and typical of projects featured here on Dev Diary, but to get a better idea of some of that newness teased, we need to go beyond the basics. So let's take a look at the draw code. The twist on this tower defense concept is that the player must place their turrets and defense machines outside of their house. But there's a problem. The player is agoraphobic, meaning that they don't like being outside of the comfort of their home. And as a result, spending too much time outside causes their energy to deplete and their vision begins to go wobbly. I don't know, the effect isn't final and I'm not sure the best way to depict anxiety without completely ruining the player's experience. But anyway, this was done via the object specifically meant to pull this effect off. First, it copies the application surface to a new surface, one that I hope to manipulate further in the future, but for now it simply acts as the canvas that applies one of gamemaker's built-in layer effects. The visibility of this effect is based on the player's energy meter, so the lower the meter, the worse the effect is. Now, this method posed an interesting quirk. The old school way of depth sorting in GameMaker doesn't work well with these effects. which meant that I had to figure out a new way to do depth sorting, and it ended up taking up most of this session time. So at the end of each step, each quote-unquote actor, aka object that needs to be depth sorted, is recorded to an array. A simple check function prevents duplicate entries, and if it's not a duplicate, another function is then used to record that object to an array. If this is the first object added to the array, or its Y position is less than the first entry in the array, it is pushed to the array. But if that object's Y position is greater than the first array entry, that object's data is then inserted into the first slot in the array. And finally, in the draw event, that array is then used to determine the order of how our actors should be drawn, pretty much mirroring the old school depth sort system. Now, I should note that I'm not entirely sure of how this does on a larger scale, and there are likely better ways to handle depth sorting out there. Personally, performance seems to be on par either way, but we'll have to wait and see. This system also doesn't work with more than 2 Y positions, so in other words, it still needs a lot of work. Anyway, that was about all I was able to get done for now. Overall, the theme and visual presentation is still not final. However, the concept of playing an agoraphobe is set in stone, and I hope to tie a lot of things to that characteristic. This will give us a reason to use the quote-unquote order system from the initial concept, and the general computer usage. There are also other plans for the turrets, but admittedly they may be a little too ambitious. As for what the player is fighting against, still up in the air. For the time being, we'll probably just stick with like temporary shapes unless something comes to mind between videos. So, what do you think of the project thus far? Is the current anxiety effect too much? How much would be too much for you as a player? Leave any and all thoughts in the comments. And hey, if you want early access to videos, playable versions of games featured on the channel, and more, subscribe to my Patreon. With that said, brings us to the end of today's Dev Diary, so thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you guys next time.